In a major diplomatic escalation, the governments of Saudi Arabia as well as other Arab nations have cut all diplomatic ties with the government of Qatar. From Al Jazeera, which is partially funded by the government of Qatar, no justification for cutting diplomatic ties. Arab countries' decisions, led by Saudi Arabia, are founded on baseless allegations, Qatar Foreign Ministry says. Qatar said there is no legitimate justification for several nations cutting diplomatic ties after Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Yemen, and the Maldives announced that they would suspend relations with the Gulf state. The Saudi Kingdom made the announcement via its state-run Saudi press agency early on Monday, saying it was taking action for what it called the protection of national security. The news agency released a statement in which it accused Qatar of harboring a multitude of terrorist and sectarian groups that aim to create instability in the region. Reacting to the fallout, Qatar explained that the decision was a violation of its sovereignty, vowing to its citizens and hundreds of thousands of residents that the measures would not affect them. These measures are unjustified and are based on claims and allegations that have no basis in fact, the statement said, adding that the decisions would not affect the normal lives of citizens and residents. The aim is clear, and it is to impose guardianship on the state. This is by itself a violation of Qatar's sovereignty as a state, it added. Qatar's foreign ministry made the statement hours after the Saudi announcement, but before Yemen's internationally backed government, which no longer holds its capital in large portions of the country. Libya's out-of-mandate prime minister later joined the Arab nations in saying that they too would cut ties. As part of the measure, Saudi Arabia said it would pull Qatari support from the Yemeni war. Airspace and sea traffic would also be affected when major Saudi and United Arab Emirates-based airlines announced that they would stop flying to the Qatari capital, Doha. The United Arab Emirates national carrier said it would suspend flights to and from Qatar starting on Tuesday. Emirates is a Dubai-based airline, and Fly Dubai, the Emirates budget airline, quickly followed suit. It was unclear how other airlines would react. Saudi Arabia had called on brotherly countries to join its measures against Qatar. The United Arab Emirates said in a statement it was cutting off all ties with Qatar. It also ordered Qatari citizens to leave the country within 14 days and banned its citizens from traveling to Qatar. Later on Monday, the Qatari embassy in Abu Dhabi asked citizens to leave the United Arab Emirates within 14 days, and so on and so forth. So, what does this all mean between Qatar and Saudi Arabia? Well, to explain that properly, explain that, I need to dive into territory on YouTube that is not quote-unquote advertiser friendly. So that means that this video is basically going to generate close to no revenue. So I do need people's support to make this kind of content, to really talk about these kind of issues that do really matter, because this is a major diplomatic escalation between two fairly important countries within the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia. And there's quite a lot of things to talk about, but because of the advertiser boycott, as well as significant pressure on social media, YouTube, Twitter, Google, Facebook, to censor these kind of discussions and just censorship on many issues, I do need people's support to be able to make these kind of videos. So consider supporting me via PayPal or Patreon if you're so inclined. Now, there's two aspects about this. First off, let's talk about the United States, because the belief that Saudi Arabia would do something like this on their own without the tacit approval of the United States is nonsense. Although Trump turned the tacit approval of the United States into the open approval of the United States. During my recent trip to the Middle East, I stated that there can no longer be funding of radical ideology. Leaders pointed to Qatar. Look, so good to see that the Saudi Arabia visit with the king and 50 countries already pay off. They said they would take a hard line on funding extremism, and all references pointing to Qatar. But perhaps this will be the beginning of the end to the horror of terrorism. Trump, you need to understand, like, regardless of what you think of Trump, and I know many people have a negative viewpoint about him, he is still the president of the United States. He still gets the top intelligence in the world, and I am not inclined to believe that Trump is just spouting nonsense out of his ass on Twitter without at least talking to the people, his national security team, about what he's about to say. I think it says quite a bit that the United States is openly, like Trump at least, is openly supporting Saudi Arabia, while Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, is calling for a de-escalation on the situation. Mind you, this entire situation could escalate significantly, but I do think it says quite a lot that this whole thing happens shortly after Trump visited Saudi Arabia, took part in the Riyadh summit, at which, by the way, the leader of Qatar was also present. But at the Riyadh summit, Trump called for a cessation of funding to extremist group. And look, everyone knows Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Gulf states, other countries, other Arab nations have all funded various extremist groups, various terror groups. And right now, you know, maybe the United States has twisted enough arms, maybe they've made enough promises. I mean, you know, just the things we hear in the news, the stuff that we get on TV, even the stuff that's more difficult to find, that's only a portion of the picture. We don't know a lot of the discussions that go on behind closed doors. We don't know what the United States and the Saudis have been talking about. We do know Trump visited Saudi Arabia, and outside of a ridiculous photo with his hands touching a globe that I'm using here, outside of that, Trump did push the Arab nations to deal with extremism, to deal with radical Islamic terrorism, though he didn't use those exact words. So I do think that at the very least, Saudi Arabia is using that particular occasion to go after Qatar. Now, why are they doing that? Why are the Saudis so intent on going after Qatar? What does it boil down to? Well, it boils down to a couple of countries. And this is why this video is not advertiser friendly, because of what I'm about to say. So, in Libya, there's a civil war going on between various groups. There's a Tobruk government and a Tripoli government. And Saudi Arabia and Qatar support different sides and have supported different sides for years. Qatar has had a fairly significant involvement within the Libyan civil war. Now, mind you, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, all these countries, they all wanted to get rid of Gaddafi, but they wanted to do so in different ways. Qatar sent hundreds of special forces to fight on the ground against Gaddafi, and they've been involved there since then. So has Saudi Arabia, so has Egypt. Which brings me to Egypt. Egypt, the split between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, is a significant part of that is because of Egypt. And mainly because Saudi Arabia declared the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization and supported the coup against Mohammed Morsi. They supported Sisi, taking out Mohammed Morsi, and becoming the president of Egypt. That's the decision they made, and they continue supporting Sisi. Whereas Qatar has continuously supported the Muslim Brotherhood. By the way, Hamas it's also the Muslim Brotherhood. So Hamas is basically a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, the more radical part. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood is a very large group across many nations, but countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, they've declared the whole thing a terrorist organization. Qatar continues to support Hamas, continues to support the Muslim Brotherhood, and this is why you have a break in diplomatic relations. I might add that there's various extremist groups linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, if not the Brotherhood itself, within Egypt that are responsible for a good number of terror attacks. Egypt is very unstable as a result of it as a country, and that's a fairly worrying sign in the Middle East. So that's another reason. Then there's finally Syria. Obviously, the Syrian civil war. The Syrian civil war is basically a proxy war between various powers: Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United States. Go on. You can go on that list, continue down that list. It's very difficult to know who exactly Qatar and Saudi Arabia are because there's so many rebel groups. I mean, we have an idea that everyone has supported or is supporting ISIS, Al-Sham, Al-Nusra, all these groups, you know, Al-Nusra being Al-Qaeda, Al-Sham being an extremist group that's not too far from them, and then obviously ISIS. But we don't know fully to what extent. But basically, the way I see it between Qatar in Saudi Arabia on this issue, especially because of the United States, is that Saudi Arabia has decided to take this opportunity to weaken Qatar and force their hand on ceasing their support for certain groups that Saudi Arabia is against, like the Muslim Brotherhood as a perfect example. Now, whether or not that means that the long term Saudi Arabia is going to cut its own funding for various groups, extremist groups, that's hard to say, but it'd certainly be a very positive development if that were indeed to happen, Because the reason we have so many wars in the Middle East is because everyone keeps funding every crazy group in the region, and no one's really willing to back off because of national security reasons. The problem with this entire situation, however, is that it could escalate. I mean, I've seen murmurings, just murmurings of war, of the possibility of war because of the situation. Now, it's no serious possibility right now, but these kind of things can escalate and they can get out of control, which is, by the way, why I'm not particularly happy with what Trump did on Twitter. I mean, yeah, he's doing it because he's showing his support. I don't think that's necessarily the wisest idea. I get the logic behind it, and yes, there is a logic behind that, because you ultimately want the Arab nations to cut their, or every nation around the world, to cut their support for various extremists, radical groups, terrorist groups. But the problem is, you might end up in a situation where this whole thing grows out of control, and that's the last thing the Middle East needs. I mean, we have the worst refugee crisis because of Syria since World War II. We have Libya, we have Egypt, we have Yemen. We don't need Qatar and Saudi Arabia at each other's throats. But, well, they've been at each other's throats for several years, but we don't need this escalation right now. But it is an issue that Saudi Arabia has forced. It is an issue that they believe they can win on. And it is an issue that is going to make things very ugly in the region, in an already ugly region where there's a lot of things that have happened, and a lot of people have died, a lot of people have suffered. There's no need to add further to that, especially when Saudi Arabia's reasoning is that they want to attack a regional rival. That's what it boils down to. Finally, I want to end this video with an update on Syria, ISIS, Iraq, because there are some things to say. See, ever since Trump has become president, what's happened is that the rebel groups in northern Syria, in this part of Syria, have had their funding from the United States, their weapon shipments and all that, cut to a very significant part. And now they're in a position where they can't do anything against the Syrian government. They've been weakened. They tried launching an offensive against Hama, in northern Hama. They failed. They've lost Aleppo. They lost Aleppo before Trump became president, and ever since then they've been, stuck in a bad situation. And then the United States cut their funding and their support for the rebel groups in the north, and so they've been losing territory in other theaters because this allows the Syrian army to deploy its forces elsewhere, like in the south, for instance, or against ISIS. I think there is a race for ISIS territory right now with the Syrian government, rebel groups in the south, the Kurds. Everyone wants to get their hands on as much ISIS territory as possible, because everyone knows that the real showdown will happen once ISIS is defeated, and ISIS will be defeated. What the United States is doing right now in Syria is that they're supporting rebels in the south, not necessarily against Assad, though Assad has moved against them because he sees them as a threat, but rather they've supported them against ISIS, and they've actually taken a fairly good amount of territory, mainly desert territory, from ISIS. The Syrian government, or rather the Iranian faction of the Syrian government, moved against them. The Russians were not particularly happy about that, and it ended with the United States bombing Syrian military forces. In Raqqa, which is obviously fairly important, the Kurds are moving on Raqqa. They haven't encircled it, but they are moving in that direction. They're moving to attack the city. They've taken a substantial amount of territory at the dam right here. They've taken it. They've taken a fairly substantial amount of ground. And despite Turkey's protests on the issue, the Trump administration has increased its support of the Kurds. I mean, Erdogan is a problem, and it's a problem we're all going to have to deal with at one point. I mean, I just put it like this about Erdogan. He's playing with fire, and eventually he's gonna burn because of it. Because how much do you think that Erdogan, that Turkey, can piss off Russia, the United States, and virtually every other country in the region with its nonsense? Not for long. Erdogan knows it, but he continues playing with that fire, and it's a very dangerous game. In Iraq, what's going on against ISIS is that Mosul has effectively fallen. The vast majority of the city has been retaken, with the exception of these two big districts. And for now, it seems that the Iraqi forces seem content with, launching some attacks, but not really on the scale that would be necessary for them to actually take the remaining territory within Mosul. Most of the city has been captured. It's just a matter of time. You could see, it depends on how they act. It could be days, weeks, even months. But eventually Mosul will fall. I mean, it is effectively fallen. For now, though, the Iraqi forces have been moving to retake other parts of Iraq back from ISIS. And in fact, ISIS, with Raqqa being under threat, has moved its operational command to Al-Qaim within Iraq, here on the border, because that's probably going to be one of their last remaining strongholds within Iraq. And things are, there's still plenty of people that are going to be dying. There's still plenty of fighting. ISIS will not go down without the fight. One big issue that's been there for years is the city of Deir ez-Zor, which, a portion of it is controlled by the Syrian armed forces. In 2 parts of the city, they've been cut off from one another, the airport and the rest. ISIS has been trying to take Deir ez-Zor for years. They failed consistently at doing so. The Syrian armed forces are simply unable to reach them, to reinforce them. So, but they're stuck in that terrible situation. They're stuck. ISIS can't take the city, and without being able to take the city, their overall strategic situation is not really all that great. So, that's the overall geopolitical context. Where do I see this going? Where do I see this developing between Saudi Arabia and Qatar? Well, could get very ugly, could de-escalate, could potentially see some good things coming out of it, with perhaps Qatar pulling back its support from various extremist groups, which would be a very welcome development for the region, because if countries stop supporting the terrorists, the extremists, the radicals, then you might actually have some solutions being developed for the region. Though I wouldn't hold my breath, and I also don't trust Saudi Arabia one bit. I don't think anyone should trust Saudi Arabia one bit, and obviously there's still Iran. Anyway, Costin here on Serious Gaming signing out. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for more. And if you like my content, consider supporting me via PayPal or Patreon.